But the most important thing that I think that when I came in, agreed to do this sort of last fall, and I took over on January 1st, thinking about, I've got these big shoes to fill. What am I going to do? How am I going to approach this job? What are my goals? And I think what we really need to do is talk about the moral and practical superiority of free market capitalism. At its very base, we still do all the little things. We still go into the weeds from time to time. But I think that when we're out talking to people, they have to know that we are coming from a moral foundation that they can agree with. So often, we get into arguments with the left, and they couch things in moral terms. It's, you know, health care for all. Nobody can learn, no kid can learn when they're hungry. That sort of thing. They argue from a moral perspective. And this really came home to me actually last night at the dinner. We had a reporter from 7 Days, not 7 Days, Vermont Digger was there, and he's a young gentleman, just out of college, completely went behind the ears, and he was shocked that we had young people there. We had, you know, a whole bunch of young, the Shade was there, and a bunch of people from Johnson and Kevin Beal, and a lot of young people were in the audience. And he said, oh, I'm really shocked that there's so many young people. I said, well, why? I mean, it makes sense to me that your generation is really the one that's going to get hammered by all these statist policies, and you don't seem to be bothered by it at all. And I started talking a little bit about the philosophy of free market capitalism. He said, yeah, but you know, it's just free market people, for young people, you're considered kind of callous and uncaring. And that's what gets to me. We really need to talk about this, the triumph of liberty. This is the thing that got me back in June. This was a quote that Bethany Knight wrote in it. She wrote a great series of pieces that were featured in the Caledonian Record. And I think this was the first or second in the 10 or 12-part series. I came across this quote, and I jumped out of my chair, and I said a word my kids probably shouldn't have heard me say. But this was uttered, a quote from the 2010 Person of the Year. This was a 30-year employee of the Vermont Department of Health and Human Services. And what this guy said is that people are kept in poverty. The whole thing was about poverty. But it's people are kept in poverty because the economic system we have, in order for capitalism to survive, you need poverty.
Oh, baloney.
That is baloney. That's what I said. Your word was much cleaner than the word that I said when I read that quote. But that is the opinion that prevails out there. That's this kid, you know, from Vermont Digger yesterday. That's exactly what he was saying to me. You know, capitalism needs poverty. It's all self-interested. What do you care about? Well, what does poverty? I mean, what does capitalism really need? We have to define it. We have to take a minute and get out there and define it. What does capitalism need? Capitalism needs capital. It doesn't need poverty. It's part of the word. Capital, money that can be used to produce further wealth. Poverty plays no part in a capitalist society. Poverty is eliminated by capitalism. Think about it. I remember once when I was chairman of the Republican Party, I had a debate at Johnson College in Senator Doyle's class with Judy Bevins, who was the chairman of the Democratic Party at the time. And she said that her greatest aspiration in getting in politics was to eliminate poverty. But she's against wealth. She doesn't want people to be able to accumulate wealth. If people accumulate wealth, she wants to confiscate it. Wealth is the antidote for poverty. So anybody who says that they want to go out there and eliminate poverty, then you have to tell them, well, okay, how are you going to create wealth? Because it's the only way to do it. It makes sense. What is free market capitalism? Talk a little bit about what it isn't, but it's also important to point out what it is. And this is the best definition that I've ever seen. It's a system in which people can engage in peaceful, voluntary exchange, free from force and fraud. And that part about free from force and fraud is very important. Because a lot of people see things that are going on like Bernie Madoff and say, that's capitalism. That's not capitalism, that's fraud. It's criminal. It does not play any part in a capitalist system. And force. Force is the other half of that coin that's so... Government is force. If I come in and I hit you over the head and take something from you, that's force. That doesn't play any part in a capitalist system. And why did I choose this little icon here of the handshake? Because when you're dealing with somebody free from force or fraud, you can't cheat them, you can't knock them over the head and take their wallets. You have to understand that person. You have to understand the person across from you. If I need food to feed myself and my family, and I need to get it from you, I have to come up with something of value to enrich your life in exchange for that thing that I need. So we both win. That's how wealth is created in the capitalist system. It's because you need something, I need something, I figure out a way to meet your needs, you help figure out a way to meet my needs, and we both create wealth. If you have force or fraud, I'm just taking from you. I'm destroying wealth. I'm not creating anything new. It doesn't benefit you at all if you have the food and I just take it. So we have to understand one another. And they always say on the other side, we want community. We want people to understand one another. We want diversity. But it's what capitalism is what creates that in reality. And think about this. Why is it that the humans form governments in the first place? When we were cavemen and Neanderthals, that situation, if you go out there and you're the guy who brings down the mammoth, and you're sitting there on top of your mammoth and somebody comes over with a club and brings you in the back of the head, you don't get to eat your mammoth, the other guy does. That's a state of anarchy. Nobody wanted to live in that situation. Why? Because you cannot create wealth in a situation like that. If you cannot be guaranteed that you bring down that mammoth, you get to control what happens to that mammoth, you can feed yourself, you can feed your family, you can barter that mammoth meat with somebody else who maybe is pretty good at making clubs. That's how societies can grow and prosper. You cannot prosper in a situation where people can use force and fraud to take what you create. Everything stagnates. That's how poverty is created. So what is the real moral basis for government? Why do we have what's the moral principle that government is founded upon? And that is hard. In a capitalist society, in a prosperous society, it's the preservation of property rights. Going back to that last slide with the two cavemen, one hitting him over, the laws that are put in place are to protect that littler caveman from getting hit by the big guy and protecting that person from having his property that he worked for, that he created. He grew the crop, he brought down the animal, he made the club. Protect that property from someone else. That is the moral foundation of government, to protect individuals' property, free from force or fraud. That is the moral foundation upon which government rests, if it's going to be a truly moral form of government. And I want to give this great example from our first Thanksgiving, because it's sort of the founding of our country, our continent, our culture here in the West. And it was founded on this conflict between a socialist collective idea of how we should govern ourselves and a capitalist idea of how we should govern ourselves. And I'll read this brief passage from the book Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick that illustrates the story. The fall of 1623 marked the end of Plymouth's debilitating food shortages. For the last 2 seasons, the Pilgrims had grown crops communally. That's how they did it. In April, Bradford, the governor, had decided that each household should be assigned its own plot to cultivate, with the understanding that each family kept what it grew, and the inhabitants never again starved. They had a collective society. There was no incentive for anybody to go out and work in the fields. The incentive was to let somebody else go out and work in the fields. And when you have that situation, nobody does any work. They consume as much as they can. They produce as little as they can, because that's the dynamic that's set up. It doesn't work. And they starved. You read the horror stories. It's a great book, by the way. I recommend it highly. They starved. But when you introduce capitalism, the ability to create wealth, the ability to protect that wealth once it's created, then you have prosperity. Then you're able to move as a society upward. You're able to have trade with other people. And this slide can't all be fun pictures. You got to have some graphs. This is, I think it's one of the most remarkable graphs that that you'll see, and this was put together by an economist named Angus Matheson, and he studies economics throughout history. And he put together this graph charting the gross domestic product per person going all the way back to the year 0. And if you look, all of the countries are about the same. There's not a whole lot of wealth production going on here. Everybody's sort of a subsistence farmer. Until right about here in the Western countries, right in the late 1600s, early 1700s, it started to creep up. And then in the 1750s, it just starts to take off. Rising, 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 rising in the Western world. In Africa and Asia, where it continues flat. What happened here? John Locke, Adam Smith, our pilgrims, just in there, discovering the principles of capitalism and private property rights, the Industrial Revolution, the explosion of a middle class, the existence of a middle class. Everybody says they want to have socialist policies to help the middle class. It's capitalism that created the middle class. It's capitalism that helps the middle class grow and expand and create wealth and lift everybody out of poverty. This dynamic here, if you're poor in the United States versus poor in Africa, Asia, a lot of these countries, you're poor down here in a country that does not have capitalism, that has never embraced capitalism, doesn't have rule of law, doesn't protect personal property rights. You are lucky if you have three walls and a roof. You're lucky if you're not getting your drinking water out of the same water source that is your toilet. If you're poor here, in a capitalist country, the United States, you have access to health care, you have access to hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of education, you probably own a car. If you don't, you have access to public transportation. You have access to medical care. That's the difference. That's what capitalism means. This is a middle class. This is even the poorest. I would rather be the poorest person in a capitalist country than the richest person in the world. Unless you're talking about kleptocracy, which is another type of statism where they don't protect property rights. It's redistribution. And that gets me to the next part of my presentation. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the other moral foundations that people try to substitute for protecting the property rights and a capitalist morality as a basis for government. And of course, the first one is redistribution. That's what we're living with now, I think most people think, that the moral foundation for government is not the protection of property rights, but the redistribution of wealth. I think that that's what they think a moral reason for government's existence is to redistribute wealth and make everything fair. So, great quote from our founding father, George Washington. Government is not reason. It is not eloquent. It is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant, and it is a fearful master. Force, there's that word. Capitalism is free exchange, free from force or fraud. So government really is supposed to be staying out of the interactions of people within a capitalist society, because you don't want to have force. And who wants to have force? I'm reading, I just finished a great book called The End is Near, and it's going to be awesome, by a guy named, what's his first name? Williamson is his last name. And he puts it very, very well. He says that all government is violence. All government action is violence. And there's a lot of truth to that, because at the end of every bill, when the legislators can agree with me or disagree with me, it should say at the end, comply with this or people with guns will come to your house and force you to. Whether it's paying your property taxes, or a parking ticket, or a jaywalking ticket. That nice little old lady who's in the town clerk's office is helping out, you cross her, and people with guns will come to your house and force you to comply with what she's saying. At its very basic element. That's force. So I'm going to go back to this slide of my caveman. I love my caveman slide. What happens when government becomes the element of force? People will say to you today that this is stability. Government coming in and making everything equal, that's stability. It's not. We're back to anarchy. If you go out and you earn your paycheck and there's no guarantee that you are going to be able to keep that. Just like the first caveman who wasn't sure that he could keep the mammoth because the big guy was going to come whack him over the head and take it away because he wanted to. That's a redistributionist philosophy. You don't create wealth that way. You destroy wealth. I don't have to know you anymore. I don't have to understand what you need. I don't have to provide you with something of value to make your life better if I take something from you to make my life better. I just take it. And it doesn't matter if I use a club or a gun or a politician to do it. The morality is the same. And we run a very dangerous game when we're playing with that kind of a moral system. I want to talk a little bit about that, getting to know one another. In a capitalist system, I have to know you. I have to understand you. I have to understand what your wants and your needs are. I have to know you as a human being. And there's a great, if you go back and read Nathaniel Phillips' full book, there's great descriptions of their relationships with the American Indian tribes when they first come. When they first come, and it's a trade relationship. It's capitalist. And they talk about the Indians as noble people. They're noble, they're honest, they're honorable. But then 60 years later, when they get to King Philip's War and they've walked away from trade, capitalism, and decided to go for government as force, you know, we just want the land, we're going to take it. Then all of a sudden, the language about the Indians changes. They're savages, they're heathens, they're barbarians. And I put it this way: state force is a means to redistribution, leads to dehumanization as justification for confiscation. If you're trying to take something from somebody, not only is it in my interest psychologically not to know you, it's in my psychological interest to hate you, to think of you as something other, to think of you as demonized. I will demonize you, then I don't have any problem taking something from you because it's okay. But it shouldn't be. Same thing is true with African Americans. They had this huge wealth of labor, and people wanted to use government in order to take it from them and redistribute it to a land-owning plantation class. State force is a means of redistribution, leads to dehumanization as justification for confiscation. They were subhuman, they were uncivilized, they were inferior. We know that that's not true. But it served as justification to take their wealth. We'd never do that today, right? Rob, you're crazy. This is happening back in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s. But we're much more sophisticated today, right? Greedy, corrupt, the 1%. Other, the other. We don't know them. We don't care about them. We demonize them. Because we want something that they have, and we want government to be our element of force to take it for us. The other thing that you can say is, well, Rob, you know, the Indians, they took all the land and they moved them off into the reservations, and those African Americans, they took all of their labor wealth and they took everything. Well, if you follow the news and you see Bill Hickelson, he's up at 63%. That's pretty damn close. 63% of everything the guy earns is confiscated by the government. And if you're a young person in this crowd, shame, looking at you, you're looking at a 70% tax rate to pay off the national debt that's been accumulated. That's a lot of confiscation going on. We're getting to that point, folks. Capitalism versus equality. That's another moral foundation that we hear a lot. Down in Montpelier, I hear it from some of those people saying, we need to make things equal. Those rich, they're making so much money over here, they don't need that much. We need to just make them pay their fair share. We need to make things equal. The disparity between rich and poor is getting to a point where it's in crisis mode. Equality, though. Here's a picture. I couldn't find a great picture of this, so this is the Lorax. A picture from the Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, which comes with all sorts of political baggage to it. But just concentrate on the image for a second. All the trees in this picture have been made equal over the course of the harvesting. Two things. One, I would ask you to notice that none of the trees actually meets its full potential. But when you're talking about equality, there's something on here that's not equal to all those trees. And that's this thing here, with the axe. Equality is not a natural state. There are big trees, there's tall trees, there's small trees, there's shrubs. If you're going to have equality as a moral basis for government, you have an equalizing force, and you have an equalized entity. And there's never equality between the equalizing force and the equalized entity. In fact, it is the greatest differential in equality that there can be. It is the difference between master and slave. So anybody that comes and says that they want to have more equality, ask them if they think that they're going to be the axe or if they're going to be the tree. And if you look at a lot of the progressives that you see down there, nobody is volunteering to be a tree. They all want to be the axe. Bernie Sanders, think of that. He's the guy with the axe. He's not the tree. And it is not equality. You get to one of my favorite quotes. George Orwell said it best in Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And we never, ever want to be in that situation. Just about at my time. I told Jackie I'd be done in 20 minutes, and I'm at 21. Just indulge me for a couple seconds here. Capitalism versus the welfare state. Is the welfare state really the moral justification for formulating a government? And who needs poverty? Go full circle and come all the way back to that first quote from that Health and Human Services Person of the Year. Who needs poverty? I will tell you who needs poverty. Government! The welfare state needs poverty in order to survive. If there were not hundreds, thousands, millions of poor people, we would not need a Health and Human Services agency. This is from their website. This is them bragging. This is not me finding something on the Cato Institute website or Heritage and saying, look at what they discovered. This is on HHS's website bragging about what they are. 83,745 employees. One of the biggest agencies within the U.S. government. They own 2,980 buildings and lease another 1,003 for a total square footage of 51,864,000. They operate in 1,240 locations throughout the United States and 12 internationally. They have a fleet of 795 vehicles and 2,930 leased vehicles. Their operating budget for fiscal year 2010 was approximately $854 billion. That's the poverty industry, folks. They say capitalism needs poverty. These people need poverty. If they were not generating more poor people, if they were not entrapping more and more people in generational poverty, they wouldn't exist. They wouldn't need that money. They wouldn't get that money. They wouldn't have their salaries. That's who needs poverty, folks. Not capitalism. Don't ever let them tell you different. One more funny-looking chart. This was put together by the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare. And they say Pennsylvania has the most generous welfare benefits in the country. I think Vermont's given them a run for, at least given them a run for their money. But they put this together, and these are the welfare cliffs, is how they describe it. So if you're earning, right here it's about $25,000, $23,000, you're actually getting through benefits about $57,000 in assets through food stamps, Section 8 housing, heating assistance, whatever it is. All that stuff adds up to that. So, but if you earn more than that, if you step over that cliff, all of a sudden your income drops precipitously. So this is how they trap people. This is how they create multi-generational poverty. This is how they trap people from actually taking that next job. It's because you look, it will take you until you're actually earning $69,000 a year from $22,000 a year to get back to the level where you feel like you're controlling the same amount of wealth. So you're trapped here. That's a huge leap of faith. It's going to be a lot of work. It's going to mean that you're going to have to put a lot of effort into that. It's just not going to be worth it. So you get to think about it. You get somebody who says, you're earning $22,000 a year in a fast food restaurant. That's great. And then somebody comes to you and says, we want to make you the manager. We're going to give you a raise. No. Don't give me a raise because that puts me here. I'd fall off the cliff. I just want to keep doing what I do. So you never get the extra skill set. You never move on. You never take on more responsibility, and you stay there. That is how this system, and I would say, I'm going to give credit to somebody going, I should have taken this slide out for this crowd, but I got to give credit to this guy for pointing out that system that I just described there, we have a design of a system that is cruel and unreal. That's what he said on the Mark Johnson show, 125:13. I almost fell out of my chair, and he stuck to that through a lot of the legislative session. And it is, and I would argue that a system that is cruel and unusual is not a moral system of government. Capitalism is a moral system of government. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I've made a good point.